My father had been gone 11 days when I sat across from Fern Calder in her corner office downtown and found out I had been living a lie for months longer than that. Fern had handled my father's estate planning for years. She was the kind of attorney who kept 3 legal pads going at once and never once mixed up a date. When she asked me to come in to begin processing the will, I assumed it would be straightforward. My father, Gene, was a careful man. He'd spent 40 years in commercial real estate across Dallas and Fort Worth, building slowly, never over-leveraging, never making a fuss about any of it. The kind of man who ate the same lunch every day and still somehow ended up leaving behind more than I ever expected. I was wrong about the straightforward part. I was 37 that year. I ran Meridian Health Staffing, a mid-sized healthcare staffing agency I'd built out of a 2-room office in East Austin 8 years before. My husband Clark had joined as COO 4 years in after we got married. He was good with numbers, good with vendors, good at the firm handshakes that close a contract. The employees used to joke that I was the heart of the company and Clark was the calculator. I always laughed at that. I thought we balanced each other out. What I didn't know was that calculators can also subtract things you never agreed to give away. That afternoon, Fern walked me through my father's assets methodically. Commercial properties in Plano and Irving, investment accounts, a warehouse lease in Garland that had been generating quiet, steady income for over a decade. When she reached the final tally, just over $22 million, I felt the air leave my chest. Not from greed, from something more complicated. The number felt like the weight of every Saturday morning he'd spent at his desk, instead of watching my soccer games, every trip he'd taken to walk a property line, instead of attending a school recital. He had been building something for me for a long time, and he'd never made a single speech about it. There was a clause in the will I had to read twice. It said all assets were left exclusively to his daughter, Greta Ann Lostson, as separate property, not to be commingled with marital assets, not to be used as collateral, not to be transferred to any other party without my written consent documented by legal counsel. My father knew me. He knew I loved too easily and checked the fine print too rarely. Fern was letting me sit with that when she glanced at her screen, frowned, and typed something. She looked up at me with the expression of a professional trying very hard to stay professional. "Greta," she said carefully, "the system is showing that you filed a legal separation agreement with the Travis County Court. It went uncontested. The effective date was 4 months ago." I heard the words. I just didn't understand them yet. "I'm sorry?" She turned the monitor slightly so I could see. My name, Clark's name, a case number, a date stamped in March. "According to the record, you and Clark signed a separation agreement. The court has it on file." I sat still for what felt like a long time. Outside, Congress Avenue was loud with afternoon traffic. Inside, the only sound was the hum of Fern's office AC. I counted 5 seconds in my head. Just 5. And then I did the only thing that made sense. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and called my own attorney. Not Clark, not my sister, my attorney. That decision, in those 5 seconds, is the only reason I didn't lose everything. I need to tell you about Bianca first, because nothing that came after makes sense without her. 3 years earlier, I'd done a charity health outreach with a church group in rural Louisiana. Clark hadn't come. He had a vendor meeting, he said. So I drove down with a colleague and spent a weekend in a parish outside Shreveport, helping set up a mobile clinic. That was where I met Bianca Tran. She was 23, quiet, with the kind of careful stillness people develop when they've learned that drawing attention to yourself causes problems. She was working as an unlicensed care aide for a neighbor's elderly mother, paid under the table, living in a house with no reliable heat. Her situation was more complicated than it first appeared. She'd dropped out of nursing school 2 years earlier when her mother's debts came due. Not the sympathetic kind of debts. Her mother, Loretta, had borrowed from a private loan company at rates that were barely legal, and by the time I met Bianca, the principal had nearly tripled. Loretta cried when she explained it. Bianca just stood behind her with her arms crossed, looking at the floor. I asked to see the paperwork. My father had always told me, if you want to help someone, start with the documents, not the tears. The loan was real. The amount owed was ugly but not impossible. I paid it off through a licensed financial firm over 3 installments, had everything properly documented, had a local notary sign off on each step. Bianca thanked me so many times, I had to ask her to stop. What I did next was more than I'd planned. I offered to sponsor her CNA certification program in Austin. I knew a good vocational school, and I knew our industry. Healthcare staffing has a constant shortage of certified aides. I told her, finish the program and I'll help you find a placement. I wasn't promising her a job at Meridian. That would have been a conflict I didn't want. But I knew enough people. Bianca moved to Austin. I found her a studio apartment, covered the first 3 months' rent while she completed her coursework, and showed her how to get around the city. She was grateful the way quiet people are grateful. Small gestures, consistent follow-through, a card every holiday. Once, early on, she came by the Meridian office when Clark was reviewing vendor contracts at the conference table. He looked up, smiled, said all the right things. Bianca asked about the business, about operations, and Clark, who never missed a chance to explain how things worked, gave her a full overview of how we managed client relationships and billing cycles. I remember thinking it was sweet. I remember thinking she was building confidence, learning how to talk to professionals. I didn't think about it again for a long time. My father had his first stroke in February. The second one kept him in the ICU for 11 days before he died, and it came in early March. Those weeks are still blurry. I was driving between the hospital in Dallas and our Austin office, answering client emails from parking garages, eating vending machine sandwiches at midnight, sleeping 4 hours if I was lucky. Clark was holding down the fort, which meant he was at the office while I was watching my father try to breathe through a ventilator. One afternoon, Clark drove down to the hospital. He brought me coffee and a folder. I need you to sign a few things, he said. The renewals for the regional insurance contracts came in, and the vendor restructuring addendum needs both our signatures. It's administrative. The broker needs it this week. I looked at the folder. I looked at my father through the ICU glass. Is anything in here sensitive? Clark smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. It's just renewals and internal structure updates. Same stuff we sign every year. I wouldn't bring it here if it wasn't time sensitive. So I signed. 3 pages. I didn't read them word for word. My father was 20 feet away with tubes in his arm, and I trusted my husband. That is the sentence I will spend the rest of my life accounting for. After Fern showed me the court record, she walked me through what the separation agreement contained. My signature was on every page. Real, unforced, exactly the way I'd signed things for years. The mailing address for court correspondence was listed as the Meridian office, not our home. Who receives legal mail at the office? Fern asked. I answered before I finished thinking. Brent, our office coordinator. Clark and Brent had worked together since before Meridian existed. Brent handled incoming mail, vendor invoices, anything administrative that came through the front. He was deferential to Clark in the way that people are when a loyalty runs deeper than a job description. Fern was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've turned over in my mind 100 times since. Greta, your father's assets are protected regardless of this separation. Legally, they're your separate property and always were. But what this separation does is clarify that Clark has no path to your inheritance. If he did this on purpose, he miscalculated badly. He cut himself off from the biggest thing you were ever going to have. I looked at my father's signature on the will. The handwriting was slightly uneven. He'd signed it 18 months ago, when his right hand was already giving him trouble. He hadn't told me about the protective clause. He hadn't explained it or made a speech about it. He'd just done it, quietly, the way he did everything. I held it together until I got to my car. Then I sat in the parking structure for a long time and didn't move. I called Perry Dunn that night. Perry and I had gone to UT Austin together. He'd ended up doing corporate investigations and had his own small firm. The kind of person who asks fewer questions than you expect and delivers more than you asked for. I told him what I knew. He said he'd get back to me in 48 hours. He called in 30. Clark wasn't in Houston at the vendor summit he'd told me he was attending. He was at a short-term rental condo in Round Rock, about 25 minutes north of the city. Perry sent me a photo. Clark coming out of the building carrying a small child. A little boy, maybe 2.5, wearing a red jacket and holding a plastic dump truck. Bianca was a few steps behind them, holding a coffee cup, laughing at something Clark had just said. She looked nothing like the girl who'd stood at the back of that Louisiana clinic 3 years ago. She was relaxed in a way she had never been around me. The boy's name was Beau, Perry later told me. Clark believed he was his son. Clark had been with Bianca for over a year. Perry traced the timeline. It had started roughly months after she'd finished her CNA certification. After I'd helped her get placed with a home care agency across town, she'd stayed in touch with Clark. Not with me, with Clark. The holiday cards had kept coming to me, warm and grateful. But what I hadn't known was that she was also texting my husband. The financial records were what finally made my hands shake. I brought May Holbrook, our senior accountant, into my confidence on a Tuesday after everyone else had gone home. May had been with Meridian since year 2. She was meticulous to the point of being difficult at budget reviews. And I had never once heard her make a decision based on anything other than what the numbers actually said. I asked her to pull every vendor payment over 2 years in 2 specific categories: care coordinator consulting and clinical compliance support. No explanation, just the records. She came back the next morning and sat down across from my desk without saying anything for a moment. "How much?" I asked. "Rough cut, $340,000 over 22 months. The vendor names sounded credible. One was called Gulf Coast Healthcare Solutions. One was Trancare Services. I asked May to trace the registrations. Gulf Coast was registered to a home address in Shreveport, Louisiana. The registered agent was Loretta Tran, Bianca's mother, the same woman whose debts I had paid off 3 years ago. Trancare Services had a P.O. box in Austin and had been dissolved 6 months after its last payment. The phone number on file was disconnected. Every payment had been approved by Clark. Every invoice was vague. Consulting services rendered. Staffing support Q3. No deliverables, no documentation, no evidence that these companies had done anything for Meridian at all. I asked May to back up every record to an encrypted external drive and log the chain of custody. She did it without asking a single question, which told me she already understood what she was looking at. "I have worked in accounting for 21 years, she said, handing me the drive. "And I have never understood how someone thinks they can hide things in vendor invoices. The numbers always talk." Clark came home that night carrying Thai food. He set it on the counter and asked how I was doing. I said fine. He said I seemed tired. I said I was. I had started carrying a second phone, one he didn't know about. After he fell asleep, I called Fern and told her what May had found. "This is no longer just a family law matter," Fern said. "We're looking at potential wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of company funds. I'm bringing in a colleague who handles white-collar litigation. And Greta, don't sign anything. Don't argue with him. Don't give him any reason to think you know what he's done." I lay in the dark for a long time after I hung up. Clark was asleep 6 inches away from me. His breathing was even, slow, completely untroubled. There's a specific kind of loneliness in realizing that the person beside you has been living a different life than the one you thought you shared. It doesn't hit you all at once. It settles in one layer at a time, like sediment. The confrontation happened because he forced it. 3 days later, Clark put a folder on my desk and told me he needed my signature on an equity restructuring document. 23% of my ownership stake transferred to his name alone, framed as a performance incentive realignment. I read every page, every line. I set the folder down. "I'd like our attorney to review this first." Something changed in Clark's face. Not quite anger. More like the expression of someone whose plan has hit an unexpected delay. "This is time-sensitive. The Hamilton Group contract renewal is next week. Then a few days for attorney review shouldn't be a problem." The silence stretched. Then Clark said, very quietly, "Greta, I know you found out about the separation." I looked at him. "I was going to tell you," he said, "after the Hamilton renewal. I didn't want it to derail the contract. You filed separation paperwork without telling me, while my father was dying in the ICU, using documents you told me were insurance renewals." Clark rubbed his face. "You were barely functional. I needed to protect my interests before the inheritance complicated everything." "Your interests. We haven't been a real marriage in 2 years. You know that." I kept my voice level. I kept my hands still on the desk. In my jacket pocket, the secondary phone was recording. "And Bianca?" He didn't flinch the way I expected. "She's not your concern. She's raising a child she says is yours. He is mine. I'd like to see a paternity test." That was when the mask came off. Clark stood up, and I saw real anger for the first time in years. Not the contained version he usually managed. The company's entire client database runs through my administrative access. The Hamilton contract requires my digital authorization. If you move against me before that renewal closes, I will pull access, and you can explain to a 200-employee client network why Meridian's systems are inaccessible. He picked up the folder. Think about what you're actually willing to lose here. After he left, I reached into my pocket and checked the recording. Clear, every word. I brought in Ida Marsh, a healthcare compliance consultant Perry knew, to look at our system architecture. She was 61 years old and had zero patience for anything theatrical. She assessed our client portal in 20 minutes and told me what I needed to know. Clark had isolated the portal access under a single administrative credential, and he alone had been making updates to the Hamilton Group account for 6 months. If he revokes that credential, Ida said, Hamilton can't access their staffing schedules, billing records, or incident reports. Nothing. They have a service-level agreement that gives them the right to terminate if access drops for 48 hours. Can you replace the credential without him knowing? With legal authorization from the CEO and proper documentation, yes, but it takes time. How long? 10 days if we push. We pushed. Loretta Tran showed up outside the Meridian building on a Thursday morning with a live stream running on her phone and Bianca beside her, holding Bo on her hip. A small group had gathered on the sidewalk. Loretta was crying into the camera about how her daughter was being threatened by a powerful businesswoman, how little Bo deserved to have his father in his life, how I was trying to destroy a family because I couldn't build one of my own. Bianca looked into the camera with full eyes and said she didn't want to take anything from anyone. She just wanted peace for her son. I watched from my office window. I called Fern. I called the non-emergency police line to document the disturbance. I sent a message to our communications contact. Meridian Health Staffing is aware of a demonstration outside our facility and is cooperating with authorities to ensure the safety of our staff and clients. I did not go downstairs. I stood at the glass and watched Loretta perform for the camera, and I thought about the first time I'd seen that face, wet with tears in a rural Louisiana parish, telling me her daughter was going to be forced into a terrible situation. I had felt so certain I was looking at genuine desperation. My father had once told me, some people have learned to use their suffering as a fishing rod. I'd thought at the time that he was being cynical. He was just paying attention. Norma, Clark's mother, arrived at my house on a Sunday without calling. She came with Clark, with Bianca, with Bo, and with a casserole dish and a duffel bag. She walked through my front door and immediately began rearranging items on my kitchen counter to make room to cook. We're going to sit down like adults, she announced. This has gone on long enough. Bo toddled into the living room and tripped on the edge of the rug. I caught him before he hit the floor. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said, "Thank you, lady." Norma watched me set him back on his feet and then said, without looking at me, "Bianca is a good mother. That baby needs his father. I don't know what happened between you and Clark, and I'm not saying everything was right, but that child is innocent." "I agree with you completely," I said. She looked at me, surprised. "The child isn't what I'm here to discuss." Clark stepped in from the hallway. "My mother just wants." "I know what your mother wants. She's wanted it for years." I picked up my bag from the hook by the door. "I'm going to the office. There's food in the fridge. Make yourselves at home." Norma had prepared for a fight and I hadn't given her one. That was its own kind of answer. The Hamilton Group contract renewal meeting was held in their boardroom on the 14th floor downtown. 8 of their leadership, 4 of ours, 2 outside observers. Clark arrived in a new suit. He looked like someone who still believed the kill switch was in his pocket. When the Hamilton team lead asked for a system demonstration, Clark opened his laptop and entered his credentials. The screen returned an error. He typed again, same error. He looked at me. I turned to the Hamilton team lead and said, "We completed an administrative security upgrade to our client portal last week. In the interest of protecting client data, we've migrated to a multi-authorization credential system. Allow me to walk you through the updated access flow." Ida stepped forward from the corner of the room and connected her laptop to the display. The Meridian portal loaded perfectly. Every account, every schedule, every billing record clean and complete. The Hamilton team leaned forward in their seats. Clark sat very still. When the client review was finished, I asked the Hamilton team to stay for one additional item. I told them that, as part of our governance review, Meridian had engaged an independent financial audit, and that we had discovered irregularities in our vendor accounts. I told them our legal team had already filed documentation with state and federal authorities. I told them the company was sound, the client relationships were protected, and we were handling the situation with full transparency. After the Hamilton team left, Clark stood and walked toward me. Perry was waiting in the hallway outside with two people I didn't introduce. They weren't there to shake hands. In the weeks that followed, the picture emerged cleaner than I'd feared and worse than I'd hoped. Clark was charged with wire fraud, misappropriation of company funds, and falsification of legal documents. Bianca and Loretta faced charges related to the fraudulent vendor entities and the coordinated harassment campaign outside our building. During discovery, Perry surfaced something else. A man named Milo had been in a relationship with Bianca before she'd moved to Austin. He came forward with documentation of his own. Texts in which Bianca had told him the child was his, then later demanded money to stay quiet, and when he couldn't pay, had shifted her attention to Clark entirely. A court-ordered paternity test confirmed it. Beau was not Clark's son. I heard this, and I thought for one long moment of Clark's face the night I confronted him. The way he'd said, "She is the woman I love," with such complete, unguarded certainty. He had dismantled our marriage, stolen from our company, and spent over a year building an entire parallel life around a child he believed was his. And the child wasn't his. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief, not for Clark, but for the version of this story where none of it had been a lie. I thought about Beau, who was 2.5 years old, and had nothing to do with any of this. I asked Fern to make sure his name appeared in no public filing. Whatever happened to the adults in this mess, that child deserved to grow up without finding himself searchable inside someone else's legal disaster. Meridian Health Staffing had its best revenue year on record 12 months later. We brought in a new COO, someone I had watched handle a crisis with integrity and handle success without arrogance. May became director of finance. Ida Marsh came on as our compliance consultant on retainer. I used a portion of my father's estate to establish a small legal fund through a women's advocacy organization, specifically for women who had been tricked into signing legal documents by someone they trusted. The fund covered attorney consultations, document review, court filing fees, practical things, the kind of help that doesn't make speeches, but makes a difference in the moment it's needed. Clark sent a letter from county lockup 8 months after his arrest, 2 pages. He used the word circumstances 4 times and the word regret once. I gave it to Fern to file and did not respond. One afternoon in early spring, I drove to the cemetery where my father was buried. I sat in the car for a while before I got out. The grass was that particular Texas green that only happens for about 3 weeks in April. Everything else was quiet. I sat at his grave and thought about the clause he'd put in his will, the one that had protected me from a person he'd never specifically named, a situation he'd never spelled out. He hadn't warned me about Clark directly. He'd never once said, "I think your husband may not be who you believe he is." He'd just built the fence while I was busy thinking I didn't need one. What I know now is what he spent his whole life trying to teach me. That love without discernment isn't love. It's a door left unlocked. That kindness without limits doesn't make you generous. It makes you a resource for people who've learned how to take. And that the most important contract you will ever sign is the one you read all the way to the bottom, even when the person handing it to you is the last one you would ever expect to be the danger. I signed my name on everything I was given because I trusted that without verifying, and the price of that was 2 years I cannot get back. A marriage that had ended before I knew it was over, and money that had to be recovered, line by line, from shell companies and P.O. boxes, and a woman I had once pulled out of the cold. But the fence my father built held, and I am still standing on the right side of it.